like a lot of other cultural documents are impressive, but it's one of the most impressive cultural documents and one of the oldest ones. So, I mean, let's look at Homer, the Odyssey, and the Iliad. They're impressive cultural documents too, but no one makes a religion out of them anymore. They used to, perhaps. How many saw the Troy? I mean, that was an absurd movie, but they totally ruined the Iliad. Made the Iliad into a joke, and the Iliad is a beautiful book. But even the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer are not really on the level of the Old Testament as far as magnitude. Some of the poetry may be superior, but as far as the breadth and scope and impressiveness, they're not really on the same level. I mean, they have their own high level, and someone in the classics department would disagree on that. But, I mean, they have one area that they're working in. They're not the whole culture of a people. The Old Testament is the whole culture of a people for about 1,500 years. And so it's a pretty select and impressive document. And the fact that people conserved it is even more impressive. So, because, I mean, what, for instance, do you have coming out of Botswana at the moment in terms of the last 5,000 years of history there? I'm sure that they have a culture, and I'm sure that they have a very respectable ways of behavior and so on, but they didn't develop a high literary culture that we're aware of. It may be oral, but it was never put into writing that we know about, and it was never gained to circulation. So the Old Testament was put into writing, and it assumed the proportions that we presently have. There's only a few cultures that got things into writing like this, that were literate cultures in the ancient world. There were the Chinese, there were the Hindus, there were the Greeks, and there were the Hebrews. The Latins came later, and then other countries followed. I mean, England didn't start writing anything in English until Alfred the Great, maybe. What's the first thing in English? Chaucer, 1100s? Yeah. Well, Beowulf is Scandinavian somewhat, isn't it? Or is it English? Is it English? Well, maybe Beowulf, but it's pretty, it's hardly comprehensible to anyone who speaks English, right? I mean, when was that written? Nobody knows. 900s or something? 800s? That'd be an oral thing that got put into writing. But it's more like the Scandinavian, what are those kind of stories that the Scandinavians put to memory, that the Vikings, because the English were more or less a Viking culture at that point. So yeah, Beowulf is something like that. But I'm saying, I mean, you know, when you go back in time, there are very few written cultures. And that's not to criticize the Eskimos or the Botswanese or the Fijians. No one means anything negative to them. It's just that a high literary culture is a rare thing. And the Old Testament is one of the most impressive ones of that. So, you know, you're really dealing with a very impressive document. But we don't want to overdo it. We don't want to make it bear more than it can bear. For instance, it's not an impressive biological document in terms of describing all the species on the earth, let's say, as Darwin might do. It is pretty impressive because the Jews, for instance, had this idea of cataloging creatures according to their eatability. So, for instance, they said you can eat, I don't know if it's in the Old Testament or in the rabbinic literature, they said you can eat only sea creatures, fish we call them, with fins and scales. Because they knew those things didn't rot or carry diseases that were obvious. Like, that means you not supposed to eat mollusks and shrimp and crabs and lobsters, although I eat all that stuff myself, all the best stuff, because we have refrigeration now. So we don't have to go according to their rules, but they knew in those days. Yeah, I was down on the beach in Mexico around 30 years ago, and some kids came along selling oysters or something, or clams in a bucket or something like that. You know, I said, oh, great, you know, it must be fresh. And I ate the thing, I got deathly sick. I thought I was going to die. So, you know, in a society where you don't have refrigeration or something like that, that kind of sea life is not consumable very easily unless you eat it right after you catch it. You know what I'm trying to say? So those rules are pretty good. And of course, without the fins and scales, things like eels and stuff, they had all those diseases in the Nile, bilharzia and all those other things that they would, worms and stuff like that, that they would carry, that were really dangerous diseases. So at some point the Hebrews really had fairly sophisticated science going in terms of medical biology, which they put into writing, etc. So they weren't total slouches in that area. But let's take Bush's recent comment. I'm not against Bush, in fact. I like some things about Bush. I mean, I think he's not as much of a cloakroom closet dweller as Clinton was. You know, he didn't go in the back room with his secretary and stuff like that. I mean, I like Clinton too, and a lot of things that he did. And you know, I think he was a big baby. You know, and you know, I mean, he did so many good things, but on the other hand, he behaved like a man-child, an overgrown child, which is sort of like sad and frightening. You know, I mean, most of my children are more mature than him. So it is, I mean, he's a very talented person, so I'm not against him. And Bush may not be as talented, but he's not doing that sort of thing. So he's got good points. But recently he came out with this statement about intelligent design, that should be taught in the universities. Well, you know, I'm not against theories being taught in universities, but that's to satisfy constituency. He's doing that because he knows there's a constituency out there, but that's a code word for anti-Darwinian biology. He knows that, you know, and he wants to satisfy that constituency. I'm not against him playing to his political crowd, but, you know, the Old Testament theory of creation is not really going to stand up to Einsteinian and Darwinian physics and biology. You know, it's a nice science for that period. It works for that period. But to try to put it into the modern period as a workable ideology is putting a little bit too much on the Old Testament than it's fair to put on it. Because what people do who do that is they make the Old Testament a laughing stock. So even though they think this is wonderful, the other 75% of the people who don't think like that are going, oh, that's what the Old Testament says? Well, that's laughable. And so they laugh at the book and they don't look at it. So the people who try to make the Bible do more than it can do and treat it in a way that it shouldn't really be treated actually bring it into disrepute. So what we're doing with the Bible actually raises it up more elegantly. So I would argue with any fundamentalist or any other person who thinks that we're doing something that isn't